Hi guys, very quick video here with some very controversial, very upsetting news that has just happened this afternoon. Very unexpected news that the Sony Marvel deal, which allowed Spider-Man to be in the MCU, has been officially dissolved by Sony so that Spider-Man cannot appear any longer in MCU films and crossover with those characters, which is very shocking because the MCU movies with Spider-Man have been very successful and they're very the story of Spider-Man now is very caught up with the MCU characters, especially with Tony Stark. And Sony apparently, well, now that they have the rights completely back with Spider-Man, apparently completely intends to continue to make movies with Tom Holland, continuing with certain storylines. And so it's just really crazy. And it's amazing to see how this has completely destroyed the internet and how people are taking sides, calling Sony too greedy, calling Disney too greedy, saying that Sony makes only bad movies, saying that Disney only makes formulaic movies. But I think that there's things that people don't really understand about the Sony and Marvel deal, so let me run through what the deal was really quick. So the deal was, after Sony had lost money on the Amazing Spider-Man franchise, especially with the Amazing Spider-Man 2, that Marvel would be allowed to use Spider-Man in a certain capacity in the MCU films. Their deal was he gets to be in 3 crossover movies, that is like Civil War, Avengers Infinity War, and Avengers Endgame, and 2 solo movies, which has now been done. And but that wasn't the only thing that they said in their deal. They also said that there need to be certain conditions to how the MCU uses Spider-Man. For example, there were certain characters that Sony wanted to keep hold of, like Venom, and there were certain conditions like Spider-Man can only be in a solo film if it is technically a crossover film, and that is why Iron Man was so prominent in Spider-Man Homecoming, and that's why Nick Fury had to be in Far From Home to make that technically a crossover movie. And not only that, but Sony got to retain the rights to certain character traits of the Spider-Man character himself. And so that has been speculated to be a lot of the reason that the MCU Spider-Man and his supporting cast are so different, because you have Aunt May, who is usually an elderly, frail woman he has to take care of, who is a hot lady in the MCU, and MJ, who is a redhead with a very positive, upbeat personality in the comics, versus being a negative black girl in the movies. And then Ned Leeds, who is a rival for Spider-Man in the comics, has become his best friend in the movies. And Spider-Man himself, as a lot of Spider-Man fans were complaining about, was much more of a lighter character and a much more, dare I say, a shallow character in his solo films. It dealt with very cliched stuff you might deal with in high school, like trying to impress a girl or trying to impress other people. And it's not that Spider-Man doesn't do those things somewhat in the comics, but in the comics there's a certain gravitas to his character and a lot of depth to it, so anyone can relate to the pressures he faces and the responsibility he faces, versus the movies, which do it in a much more stereotypical high school movie, but it's a superhero movie way. And that had a lot of Spider-Man fans divided, saying that this new MCU Spider-Man, even though they love Tom Holland, is not their Spider-Man. And they blame Disney for it and say, well, Disney just likes to sugarcoat everything and make everything formulaic, when really, in reality, it was just about this Sony deal. And the whole deal, and the reason why Sony wanted this to happen, is because they wanted the deal with Marvel to eventually fade out after they'd made some money, so that they would get the rights to Spider-Man back as a whole, and so they could use the traditional iconic versions of the Spider-Man characters. And I think that's interesting that they allegedly made it so that Disney couldn't use the darker and more serious elements of Spider-Man, the very put-upon schmuck Charlie Brown aspects, if you understand what I mean. But in Into the Spider-Verse, which is a very good movie that Sony made, they had a Peter B. Parker who is like those Charlie Brown put down, beat down by the world. He has those aspects taken almost to a parody level. So now Sony has the full rights back, supposedly. There are some people who are speculating that maybe this is just Kevin Feige's way of pressuring them to give him what he wants from Spider-Man, because there was something going on with the rights battle, because Kevin Feige had run out of his contract. He had made all 5 Spider-Man movies that he was allowed to make, but he wanted to make Spider-Man 3, and for all intents and purposes, they were going forward with that, so obviously the deal was going to be altered and that something was going on with that, but this is the result, and apparently what happened is Marvel asked for basically 50-50 out of the profits for Spider-Man in general, and Sony didn't want that, and they offered Disney a 5% deal, and they wouldn't have that, and so Sony took all the Spider-Man rights back. So, now this is kind of just a very frustrating place, because on the one hand, where I think it probably is good for Spider-Man fans is now I don't think that there's much holding them back from getting a traditional Spider-Man. The problem is I don't trust Sony to do good, well-made Spider-Man movies because they really haven't handled him well in the past. I said this on Twitter. I think that Spider-Verse was only a good movie because of the writing team they got behind it, and I can't remember the 2 men's names who wrote Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse and they had a big creative hand in it, but they are behind the Lego Movie and Cloudy with the Chance of Meatballs and 21 Jump Street, and very successfully written movies, and they kind of have the ability to take any project and make it very well written. Otherwise, I think Spider-Verse would have failed. And I know I'm in the minority, but I'm not even a fan of the Raimi Spider-Man movies. I think there are good things about them, especially thematically in Spider-Man 2. But ultimately, those movies were killed for me by Tobey Maguire giving a very dead-eyed performance. You know, you couldn't really... I just felt like I could not read his face throughout the movie, and a lot of people, even people who like the Raimi fans, will agree with that he gave a very dead-faced performance and didn't give a lot of emotion. And I feel, I'm not going to review the Raimi Spider-Man movies and all of the problems I have with them right now, because I think I'd have to go a lot more in depth, and I have to take more time to write down my thoughts and be articulate to make the right argument against it. But suffice to say, I don't feel like Sony in general has done a very good job with Spider-Man, except for Into the Spider-Verse. And they have especially a problem with Avi Arad making decisions over there. But on the other hand, the MCU Spider-Man I wasn't that happy with. I like Tom Holland. I like him in the Avengers movies, the crossover movies. I'm on both sides of the aisle with the Spider-Man solo movies in the MCU, where I agree that I think that they can be fun movies, but I think that they really have lost the depth of Spider-Man's character and what made him work so well. So, but I think so I'm glad to be potentially getting back a classic Peter Parker with the relatable aspects a lot of people saw in him. But I'm also very sad because I don't want Spider-Man to be out of the MCU, and I want, or with people who I don't think have handled him very well generally. What I would ultimately want is Spider-Man, the entire Spider-Man franchise, to be given over to the MCU, because Kevin Feige does want to use the traditional elements of the Spider-Man character. He's not just forgetting them and trying to do cheap high school movies. So I would just wish that the entire MCU could have the Spider-Man rights as a whole, and that they could be able to work with all the elements that they would have then. And I know people are going to disagree with that. A lot of people think that Sony handles Spider-Man the best and that they should have all the rights, and that they don't understand the deal and think that Disney is just butchering Spider-Man's character on purpose. So I know this is a very divisive topic, and I think it's going to be a little strange going forward because, again, Sony now is going to try to work with a Spider-Man who has so much of his character and characters, supporting cast, and his personality bound up with the MCU. I mean, you can't just ignore Tony Stark completely after how much they built him up there, and you can't ignore the things he's gone through in Infinity War and Civil War. And so it's how is Sony going to work with that now, and how is the MCU going to explain Spider-Man's absence? Are they going to? I don't think it can work to just say, oh yeah, Spider-Man had his identity revealed in Spider-Man Far From Home, and then next morning we found him dead in his bathtub. I don't think you can do that. So it's just a very, I don't think this is the end of the story. I think we're going to find other things that are going to happen going forward, other deals going to be made. I don't think that this is the end of Spider-Man in the MCU, to be honest. I might eat those words, but right now I just don't see that this is the final word, that yes, Spider-Man is officially out of the MCU and Sony is the only one going to be using Tom Holland right now, because right now it doesn't even make sense for them to use him. So Thanks for watching this video, and tell me what you disagree with what I've said. Do you love the Raimi films? Do you think that Sony works Spider-Man the best? Or do you think that we've had a big loss to the MCU? And what do you think is going to happen next? Leave your comments below. Thank you.